now we turn to Vladimir Popov, whose paper title is very long, but in short, calling into question the need for foreign direct investment for further Russian economic growth.
It's very nice to see everyone. It's nice to be here on the 20th anniversary, and it's nice to continue the debates that were going on already for 20 years. The theme of the paper is about the need to import foreign capital, whether it makes sense to import foreign capital or not. And here's the problem. The problem is that the growth rates in the Russian economy in recent years were not very encouraging. The growth rates are in pink, and this is the left vertical axis, and the blue line is the oil prices. So if these are the growth rates, but if you put the issue into perspective, since 1989 the growth rates were negative, the output was going down, down, and down. It reached the lowest point, something like 55% of the 1989 level in 1998, when there was a currency crisis. Then it was going up. It virtually restored itself to the late Soviet levels in 2007. But then there was a recession of 2008, 2009, and the output fell again. Then it was going up and up and up, and virtually restored itself to the late Soviet level. But then there was another recession associated with the decline in oil prices, and some people say with the Crimean development and sanctions and so on. So not only the GDP is today roughly at the same level as it was in late 1980s. Don't confuse GDP and personal consumption. Personal consumption increased. GDP consists of investment and consumption. So personal consumption increased roughly by 50%. Very uneven, but it increased overall. However, investment went down and public consumption went down. So GDP as a whole and GDP per capita is roughly at the same level as in the Soviet Union. So for 30 years, there was no growth. There were ups and downs, but no growth. Now, on top of that, Russian economy became kind of a petro state because it seems like it's going up when the oil prices are high, it's going down when the oil prices are low. So people, of course, were talking about it, and there are some people in the room that are roughly the same age as I am, and probably they remember that for 30 years it was discussed that the Russian economy is based on resource exports, and we need to shift to the new model. And this new model will be based on manufacturing exports, on production of manufacturing goods, on the high-tech technologies, and so on. So this was discussed times and again. There were plans, new plans to shift to the new economy. And somehow, meanwhile, the Russian economy, the share of machinery and equipment in Russian exports was going down, and the share of oil and gas and other commodities was going up. It was fluctuating because of the fluctuation of prices. But if you take the fluctuation of the prices away, basically there is a deindustrialization, progressing this deindustrialization going on and on and on. So what is the reason for that? Well, some say that the reason is that there is poor investment climate in Russia and you cannot attract enough capital. And that is why the economy is doing as well as it is supposed to do. Now, this comes from the ideas in development economics in 1950s and 1960s. At that time, in development economics, there were ideas associated with it was called the theory of the big push. Developing countries are poor because they are in the poverty trap. They cannot increase their savings and investment because if they start to save, there is not enough money for consumption. So half of the population will starve, probably to death. So what do you need to get out of the poverty trap? You don't generate enough savings and investment, so you stay poor all the time. You need a big push which comes from outside. You need imports of capital, maybe like the Marshall Plan, maybe the massive injection of capital encouraged by the international organizations. And once you have this injection of capital, you get out of poverty and you can keep your savings rate high, and then you can stand on both legs and you can develop by itself, financing your investment by your own savings. Now, these theories, Arthur Lewis, Ragnar Norske, Alfred Hirschman, there are many names, big names in development economics. The theories crashed probably in the beginning of 1980s when there was a debt crisis in Latin America. Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa were developing in 1950s, 1960s pretty much okay, but then it turned out they accumulated so much debt They created behind the protectionist wall the enterprises which were not competitive when they took away protectionist wall. It turned out there are a lot of debts, and the enterprises cannot generate exports and foreign currency in order to pay for these debts. So there was a lost decade in Latin America. There was a lost decade in 1980s. There was a lost decade in Sub-Saharan Africa in 1990s. And on top of that, in East European countries that also imported capital, there was also a lost decade in 1990s. Meanwhile, this was in development economics, but meanwhile, without any theories and without any development economics, East Asia, just by experimentation of strong-hand politicians, without many theoretical background, was showing 10% growth rates. And on top of that, East Asia was exporting capital. Exporting capital and exporting savings to finance someone else's development. Like China, until recently, was exporting capital to finance American development because the accumulation of Chinese reserves is the investment. It's like the export of a state capital. It's like the reserves are invested in 90 days US Treasury bills. Now, I probably should say a couple of words about the balance of payments. The balance of payments, let me show this chart. Most people are not economists, so the balance of payments consists of three parts. First, it is export minus imports, how much currency you generate. The balance of payments is with the central bank. The central bank matches the supply and the demand for foreign currency. The currency comes into the country because of two reasons. First, exports minus imports, right? You export, you earn money. Second, there is capital movement, inflow, outflow. If capital flows in, imports of capital brings you foreign currency. So it's export of goods and imports of capital. And usually imports net export of goods, which for Russia is the blue bar, which is current account. Current account balance of goods and services, this is called. It is matched by the capital account, which is the exports of capital. Exports of capital takes the money away. So basically the story is that as an exporter in Russia, I'm earning foreign currency, and I'm putting this foreign currency somewhere outside the country. By the way, if you're putting it inside the country, but you keep it in dollars, this is internal capital flight. For the purpose of balance of payments, is what matters is not the geographical boundary. What matters is the currency. If I keep it in dollars in the Russian bank, which is perfectly allowed, that means that there is an increase in the currency holdings of residents and non-residents for that purpose, and this is capital flight. I have 2 minutes, so I have to move further without explaining the balance of payments. So the balance of payments is balanced when these two parts do not match each other. It is balanced by the increase or decrease in foreign exchange reserves. It's easy to think about increase or decrease in foreign exchange reserves as the flow of government capital. This is the central bank of the government that accumulates this discrepancy between exports of goods and imports of goods and exports and imports of capital, and does something. Either accumulates reserves or it runs down reserves. Right? Now, if we look at the previous chart, there are 3 groups of countries. One is in the northwest. And these are the countries, the typical developing country. These are, by the way, all the countries with a population of 50 million. Developing countries with a population of 50 million, just to show some. These are the countries that have the negative current account and the positive capital account, right? So they import more than they export, and how they do it? They borrow money from abroad, or they get foreign direct investment from abroad. There is a second group of countries that that experience capital flight and have to pay for the capital flight, and how they pay for the capital flight, they maintain positive current account. That means they export more than they import. And when you export more than you import, that means your consumption is lower than your production. You finance the development of some other countries, right? And finally, there are countries, mostly of East Asia, that have positive capital and positive current account. And they could have moved to this side by a very simple technical device. They should allow the exchange rate to appreciate, and then they will import more. They can live at the expense of the other countries. If they import capital, that means they can live at the expense of the other countries. They can import more than they export. But they choose not to do so, and that is why they're growing. If you look at the other chart, you can see that growth is usually associated with a positive current account. Or positive current account is associated with growth. And even if you control for a couple of variables, for instance, such an important one as the GDP per capita, the relationship still holds. So what is the explanation? Why it is the case that in order to grow fast, you need to maintain the positive current account? You would think that naturally you have to supplement your domestic savings by the foreign savings. It would be good for you. But not everything, yes, that is good for you, not everything that is obvious is actually good for you. So what happens, and these are the last phrases since I exhausted my time already, what happens is that if you have a poor investment climate, capital flies out. And if capital flies out, it's known, it doesn't matter how much capital you bring in, it will fly out anyway, right? So what is needed is mobilization of domestic savings and transformation of these domestic savings into investment. And once you do it, all the investment come to you. Investors usually are very much persuaded by growth. If you engineer growth domestically, this is called new developmentalism. This is the new world, the new word in development economics. And it is put forward by someone who has a beautiful name of Luis Carlos Bresser Pereira, who was previously the Minister of Finance of Brazil. Thank you so much.
And so we'll open it up to questions and comments. Harley?
Thank you. I'm Harley Balzer, Georgetown University. I guess for both Hillary and David, there's another side to the story you're both telling, and I'd love to get your comments on it. In 2011, the Russian government prepared some data for the Asia-Pacific Economic Meeting, and they said that they had about 1.2 million small businesses, about 300 to 350,000 medium-sized businesses, and about 3.5 million individual proprietorships. In 2015, I saw a report that the number of Russian businessmen selling their businesses had increased 14 times. And I wondered what this meant. And at the end of 2015, Putin said that, confirmed that 350,000 entrepreneurs had sold their businesses and moved abroad. That number has obviously gone up to somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 by now. And it hasn't slowed down. Some of this consolidation really would suggest that there has been a phenomenal flight of the businessmen. We don't know which ones, but that would certainly affect what both of you are talking about.
Thanks. Over here.
Thank you. My question is to Maria. It's really interesting, and I buy your overall argument that even though sort of as the economic conditions decline in the Central Asian countries and sort of regimes become vulnerable, and then Russia can come, to their aid. Well, I wanted to ask you if there is any variation that you observe in your research sort of between the Central Asian countries, right? Because I was thinking kind of to this whole distinction between Guam and kind of, Eurasian Union countries. In other words, say a regime like Azerbaijan, which hasn't been like super, pro-Russian kind of, historically. Do you see this Russian influence being somewhat affected by these divides, or maybe not? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is to Professor Apple. I'm just curious to what extent you're seeing the elites who have been leashed in sort of skirt these restrictions and put property and assets abroad in the names of their mother-in-laws and so forth.
So I think actually we've gathered three here, and I'm going to abuse my position here as chair and add a couple more. For Hillary, I was just wondering whether you had seen any correlation between that initial drive of renationalization and the passage of the Magnitsky Act, which seemed to, I think, coincide in terms of the timing just before the big Putin speech in 2012 that you referenced. David, I wondered about if you could talk a little bit more about this fantastic number that you found on FAS prosecution of anti-monopoly cases. Is it 60,000 a year compared to 100 by USD? So is there any impact of all of that? It'd be very interesting to know a little bit more. And I guess a final comment, it does seem that if, given your conclusion that there's disproportionate, or that is, sanctions are not quite as effective when you have these massive national champions and monopolies, because they can sort of find ways around it through political protection. And presumably the flip side of that is that sanctions are more effective against firms that actually have to compete more, right? And aren't receiving the same privileges from the state, and that they're probably disproportionately affected by the sanctions. And I just wondered if you could respond to that. So why don't we start in reverse order? I guess so far no questions have been directed to Vladimir, although if you'd like to add anything to what's been said.
Well, there were no questions directed to me, so I think.
So then, Maria?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of differences in terms of kind of bilateral relations of Russia with those countries. So I presented an oversimplification, kind of some tendencies and trends. And secondly, it's important to know that there are opportunities for Russia to increase its influence, but there is a question as to whether or not Russia is going to act on those opportunities, because just like the United States, it has been using its foreign policy towards those states, towards some other geopolitical goals, and it has traditionally placed all of the baskets into the European theater. But again, in terms of the general trends, the countries that have been already more dependent on Russia, like Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Belarus, they've been particularly strongly affected by the deterioration of economic conditions. I would say that Kazakhstan has suffered partly because of what's going on in the European Union. So the decline in the trade turnover, the EU is a major trade partner for Kazakhstan. So the decline in the trade turnover between the EU and Kazakhstan has made Kazakhstan more vulnerable. So Russia has seen an increase in turnover in Kazakhstan, but it's favoring Russia much more than it does Kazakhstan. But again, there is the emergence of new actors. So India, I haven't said anything about India, but Kazakhstan has been exploring many more options of bilateral relations and trade with India, which became a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization just recently, along with Pakistan. So there are lots of moving pieces in this landscape. So there are opportunities for Russia, there are opportunities for other states, and Russia may or may not capitalize on those opportunities, and a lot is contingent upon what the United States is going to do. So we all just heard about its announcement about the policy in Afghanistan, how it's going to play out. It benefits Russia on the one hand because it frees up resources that it would have otherwise had to invest into strengthening security on the border with Afghanistan. But it will also challenge Russia in the medium or long run if the United States needs the overflight rights or basin rights in those republics. So, all these kinds of things will play a role.
Great, thanks. Great questions. Partly, I completely agree with you that it was really a disastrous time for small and medium enterprises after the crisis. And to add to your list of statistics, even 120,000 business people that were accused of economic crimes, and then Putin saying that the majority of them lost their business once these prosecutions started. However, I would say that we're starting to see a bit of a reverse trend in the last couple of years. There's the 2-year tax holiday that was being put on in 2014 to try to stimulate the SME sector. And there's the Agency for Strategic Initiatives, which is putting out these roadmaps in order to improve business climate in the regions and induce competition between them, changing their policies. And you actually see this uptick in fixed capital investment in the first 6 months of 2017, and it looks like, again, how much we trust those statistics, that a lot of it's actually coming from the small and medium enterprises, at least in the last year. How long this is going to last, how sustainable or durable this kind of reverse trend is going to be, we don't know, but the Russian government is investing a lot of resources because it understands the huge problems that you cited. Sam, I'll take your second one more. I think we can think about sanctions cutting off 2 things, access to foreign capital and access to technology. And the first one, how effective they are is the availability of ready substitutes for the domestic firms in terms of going around them. So with the access to capital, like I said, these large corporations can look internally to a lot of the development banks and the state itself to substitute for the Western markets that have been closed off to them. The smaller firms, like you talked about, don't have those opportunities. They're so reliant on political connections to get loans, if they get them at all, and they're at such exorbitant interest rates that they're probably not going to take the risk. However, both sets of firms, both the state corporations and the smaller ones, are still being hit equally by that access technologization, that there's no other ready substitutes around those two, so that there's going to be a shock to firms across the board. And then lastly, about that 60,000 prosecutions, they're trying to reduce it. They put a temporary ban on prosecuting individual entrepreneurs and small enterprises starting in August going forward. So they're trying to get those numbers down, but it's alarming how many resources were devoted to going after the type of firms that we would never think of as monopolies in the Western world. How much those regulations actually filter down to the bureaucrats, and whether or not those bureaucrats are benefiting from prosecuting these firms or taking over it, we just really don't know. Maybe in a year we'll have some evidence of whether or not the statistics have shifted.
So, one question for you.
Yes, so Harley, just to say, I agree that capital flight is absolutely a part of this.
Capital flight was part of this, and it was in the introduction of the memo, but I will say that the memo was focusing on restrictions on civil servants and politicians. And so in some ways there's an overlap, because there is a restriction on executives and state-owned enterprises from holding foreign bank accounts and foreign securities. So certainly that falls in this category, but it would also apply that there have been different campaigns, appeals to people's patriotism to try to encourage business people to bring their capital back into Russia. So I agree with you 100%, and I do make reference to that. The question about whether or not this has led to people trying to give their mother-in-laws their wealth. In fact, something mentioned also in the memo is that there was an uptick in official, I guess, divorce rates among politicians, because their spouses, their ex-spouses, could actually keep those foreign bank accounts. And again, allegedly it was claimed that this was because it was a response to this. But of course you don't have to get divorced. You know from the leaks of the Panama Papers that there were 16 Russian billionaires whose names matched those in the files. So there are ways through foreign trusts that you can try to hide wealth, because it's very hard to see who the beneficiaries are of those trusts. So I wouldn't want to say that this was foolproof, and certainly politicians themselves said there were too many loopholes in the repatriation campaign. Yet nonetheless, I think it remains a political tool, as I mentioned in my remarks, that knowing you have wealth abroad and knowing you are violating these rules, these bans, is a kind of muffle, I think, on your own dissent, right? You don't want to attract attention knowing that you're vulnerable and you're violating these requirements. Finally, the Magnitsky Act. Yes, in fact, it's a good point. Yevgeny Fyodorov of United Russia did say that this was the Magnitsky Act was a kind of political blackmail to compel Russian officials to be more obedient. And the Kremlin implied that there was a plausible threat of foreign asset seizures, and that this did undermine national security. So this was an anti-corruption campaign, but it was also a kind of patriotic national interest, national security campaign or dimension to it as well in the way in which it was sold. So I absolutely agree that there was a concern for national security in the way in which this whole campaign was crafted.
Thank you so much. I just thought that in the spirit of true Panasian's discussions, I may argue with David Zakoni. Yes, I have something to say about the perception that economic growth can be maintained by strong competition and by small and medium-sized companies. There are some traditional, conventional beliefs that are not supported by the evidence. One is that import of foreign capital is needed for growth. This is not the case in East Asia, at least. The other is that small and medium-sized enterprises are crucial for economic growth. We don't know examples of economic miracles that are created on small and medium-sized enterprises. If you go to East Asia, what is the Japanese story? The Japanese story is that there were monopolies and monopoly rent, and that there were zaibatsus and keiretsus and zaibatsus. If you go to Korea, you know that there were chaebols, or chaebols, yes, how they pronounce it differently. So very often, small and medium-sized enterprises are not indispensable for economic growth, and even more so, the major growth cases that we know were not associated with these small and medium-sized enterprises. The small remark is that you said that 70% of the Russian economy, directly or indirectly, is associated with the government. Well, this indirectly is kind of a, indirectly everything is associated with it. But there is a statistics of EBRD. The share of GDP created at private enterprises. In Russia, it was 75% in 1990s already, and then it was going down to 70%. So this renationalization, starting with Rosneft's story and the others, led only to the decline by 5 percentage points. And the last point, airlines. I don't know to what extent it's true. I was not looking at airlines industry directly. But what we hear in Russia is that small airline companies were reasons for a large number of catastrophes. And they were not, it was not possible to impose the strict regulations that are demanded, that are required in airline business. And for the large companies, it's easier to impose this regulation. So this is this was one of the rationales behind the concentration.
Why don't we do another round of? Oh, sorry, Maria.
Thank you. I would like to a little bit continue with this discussion of renationalization or monopolization, and a question for David or Vladimir or anyone else who studies this topic. The question is this: how much of what we are seeing in terms of small and medium-sized businesses disappearing, which is due to the efforts at the renationalization versus criminalization? What I mean is this, that we also know that some of those small and medium-sized enterprises cannot survive because they cannot sustain paying high rents to the criminal groups operating locally. And we also know that the Russian state has been colluded to a greater or lesser extent into organized crime. So hence, can we really say something about what is exactly going on, particularly with small enterprises? Is this renationalization and monopolization, or it's criminalization of the market in Russia?
So hold your answer to that question. Whoever wants to answer it. Arkady over here.
Arkady Moshes, Finnish Institute of International Affairs and Commerce. I have a maybe follow-up question for Marie, but maybe it's not a follow-up. I was intrigued when you said something in your last slide that the EU and US should reconsider its approach to the region, including Russia. Could you elaborate on that? Because I'm not sure I understood. Because if you meant the financial side of the story, I think it's quite difficult to put on paper. I will give you an example. What I mean is it's not possible to overpay Russia. According to IMF statistics, within 11 years from 2005 to 2015, Russia gave Belarus $100 billion of subsidies. It's almost 10 billion a year. The current EU program of technical assistance to Belarus earmarks, if everything works, 90 million within 4 years. When people talk about this new Marshall Plan for Ukraine, which is probably not going to materialize, but what they are talking about is 5 billion a year for a country the size of Ukraine, whereas Russia is giving Belarus twice as much within a year without much ado. But anyway, maybe you meant something else, and in any case, it would be great if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
In the back.
Dylan Royce, PhD here. I thought that Vladimir's and David's presentations made a very interesting counterpoint to one another, actually. I was wondering if David could talk at all about whether he thinks that there is, so in economics there's usually upsides and downsides to anything that happens, and I was wondering if there is a possibility of an upside for the Russian state in the events that he describes, in that traditionally the Russian state has had a lot of problems with tax revenue, and one potential upside of monopolization and an increased state role in the economy would seem to be that it might be conceivably easier to generate tax revenue, which could potentially then perhaps make it easier. And then if that is possible, would that potentially lead to the ability of the state to invest in economic growth in some capacity? And then for Vladimir, I was wondering if you, I've seen the same argument made with varying degrees of detail in Russia and by Russian sources, and so it certainly does seem to be in the consciousness there. I'm wondering if the government is currently, seems to be actually doing anything to promote its savings and investment within the economy, either by increasing the incentives for citizens or trying to encourage its own businesses that are either directly or indirectly under its control to invest in long-term growth. Thanks.
Up here in front.
Okay, thank you. Nikolai Petroff, Moscow. My question goes to Russian-Finnish Professor Gelman. And it's for how long you think it's possible to live in your trap? Perhaps if it's forever, then it's not that bad. If not, how would you see the way out? And what would you recommend to your fellow countryman Alexei Kudrin as one of major leaders of these technocrats? Thank you.
Wayne Merritt, just a comment. Small and medium-sized enterprises tend to have a fairly high failure rate in almost any economy. In this country, it's axiomatic that it's about 2/3. If you put that into a much less benign environment, such as that exists in post-Soviet Russia, and you add to that criminalization, corruption, abuse of power, to me, the remarkable thing is not just that anybody tries, but that as many succeed as do. That the failure rate is so phenomenally high strikes me as almost predetermined.
Gulnat Sharafudinova, King's College London. I had a question to David and potentially to Vladimir Popov as well. These observed trends of consolidation and nationalization, does it go in parallel with the sort of breaking links with the global economy or not? Is there any information that the degree of globalization of Russia's economy integration into global economy is lowering? Is there any data or observations on that? I mean, given the sanctions and the auto-organization, I just wonder if these are interlinked processes that could be observed as well. Thank you.
All right. So why don't we start with Vladimir? Directed to you.
Thanks, Nikolai, for the question. Let me reformulate it a little bit. To what extent this technocratic trap, when there are some sort of prudent policy advices taken into account very much selectively and implemented inconsistently, can be a long-lasting equilibrium. And I think that as long as the current regime exists, it needs some sort of prudent policy advice, and moreover, in some policy areas like financial policy, taxation, and the like, the quality of this expertise is quite relevant, and many suggestions taken into account, reasonably well, I would say, much better than in many other countries. The point is that there are some boundaries, and these boundaries cannot be exceeded substantially. But my guess that without some sort of major crisis, either politically driven crisis or economic crisis, there is no major risk of disequilibrium. Having said that, I would say that probably without these policy advisors, the quality of decision-making would be much worse. And we could not exclude such a possibility. Well, imagine that tomorrow, for whatever reason, Putin will fire Nabiullina and appoint Glaziev to be the chair of the Russian Central Bank, or something like that. Even thought there is a technocratic trap, and the impact of technocrats diminished, as the case of Lukaev suggests, we should not completely disregard the role. Without this strata of well-qualified experts, well, my guess the situation could be much worse than it is.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for the questions. If I can start with a question about whether the government is doing something about savings and investment. Well, not much, I would say. With regards to savings, you can say that there is research showing that countries that don't have the pension system, they have higher savings rate. So one way to promote savings, personal savings, is to abolish pensions, right? So this is currently under discussion in Russia, not in the form of abolishing pensions, but in the form of increasing the pension age. And this will probably contribute to greater savings. However, greater savings is not a problem, right? Savings can be stimulated, but this savings will fly abroad if there is no proper investment climate. And there is a trick, technical trick, whether you like the government or you don't like the government, but when public sector doesn't, well, excuse me, when private sector does not invest, then if the government takes a lead and invests instead of the private sector, this triggers economic growth. Private sector maybe is not investing because of corruption and this and that, or investment climate, but this will never change in the foreseeable future. Yes, what you have to do is to trigger growth, and then it will help you to fight corruption and create the appropriate investment climate. In East Asian countries, the government spending overall, as compared to GDP, are very low, lower than in the countries with a similar level of GDP per capita and similar size of GDP. Now, the investment expenditure of the government are higher than in the other countries. So in East Asian countries, even though the governments are small, they are investing a lot. The other point is about I thought you said it, maybe I didn't understand you correctly, about criminalization in the former Soviet Union and in Russia. You were talking about the small and medium-sized businesses going out, going away from the market is a normal phenomenon, and you said that even in the Soviet Union, yes, there was a, maybe I didn't understand you correctly, but anyway, the point is that in the former Soviet Union, criminalization was way below than it is today. If you look at the shadow economy and if you look at the crime rates and murder rates, they are all considerably lower. And the last point, nationalization. Does it mean that globalization is going down in the Russian economy? Not at all. The Russian government was refraining from any measures to, except for agricultural sanctions, from any measures to somehow, to protect the Russian economy from the external market and to impose restrictions on capital flows and foreign direct investment. On the contrary, Russia is, despite all these sanctions, Russia is saying, well, we'll develop these relations and so on. So Russia wants very much to be part of the world economy. If you look at different countries, the kind of resistance to globalization comes because of two economic reasons. First, if the country is doing poorly, so if the country is not growing. And second, if there is an income inequality is increasing. For instance, in the United States, they were gaining from globalization, but certain groups of the population were painted into the corner. And this is the resistance to globalization. We need to build the wall, we need to stop the trade with China and so on. Brexit, by the way, in Britain, if you look at the British membership in the European Union, the British GDP per capita started to catch up with the European level. In the post-war period, the British GDP per capita as a percentage of European level was going down. Britain was falling behind. British industry was not competitive because it was oriented towards colonies, India and other colonies, former colonies of Britain. And when Britain entered the European Union, it gained considerably. Its process stopped. But income inequalities were growing up, and certain parts of the British population, large parts, yes, voted against Brexit. In Russia, this is not happening, even though the real incomes are going down. So I think this is kind of encouraging development. Thank you.
Great. There's a lot here, so if I don't get your comment, please find me and spar with me after these comments. But I'm going to push back on a couple of the things that Vladimir said and answer a couple things. First, the 70% is straight from a government report from the Federal Antimonopoly Service. We define private differently. So the way that they define private, and I do in my own work, is that if you have any state ownership, however be minority, you are a state-owned enterprise and you fall under the category of government. When you use that definition, it's 70%. If you only take 100% state-owned enterprises, it's closer to the numbers that you're talking about. The government has minority stakes and golden shares in so many different sectors that number reflects the reality much more than the EBRD reports from 10 or 15 years ago. Secondly, about the airlines, I was referencing our own airline consolidation and not talking specifically about the Russian case. However, just a quick comment on that. If airlines are consolidating because they're crashing or because there's bad quality, that's an unequivocally good thing. If airlines are consolidating because the dominant players are forcing them out or making life so difficult for them because of barriers to entry, because of other regulations that they enjoy, that's a bad thing. So I agree with you that crashes, an airline that is susceptible to crashes should go out of business. But an airline that's doing a decent job and needs some help getting going and becoming that size, that is being stymied from above, that's not good consolidation. And lastly, about this developmental state argument, I disagree with you. There's a really big divide on how you generate economic growth in transitioning countries. I'm more of the missing middle camp, that they're the best economies of scale, the best innovation, the most export-oriented enterprises are coming from the middle, not from the large and not from the small. And you need policies that promote small enterprises from becoming that middle size. I don't think Russia can pull off the developmental state. They're trying, that's where all the rhetoric is, but that was a really unique configuration of circumstances among the Asian tigers that it's not going to be easily replicated in Russia moving forward. I'd rather come on the side of the development economic literature that says, have your smaller enterprises grow to the medium size, and just like in Germany and other fast-growing economies, that's where the most sustained economic growth in the long run is going to come from. And finally, on the tax dividends, you can tax better when there's fewer people, but your revenue might go down because even if there's a couple of evaders in that sector or in that level below the big guys, if there's more taxpayers, the overall volume will probably go up instead of there's fewer taxpayers in that largest level. And then, as you know, a lot of the debates aren't just about tax rates for state corporations, it's about dividends. So there's a whole another issue of negotiation between the government's corporations, how they're trying to extract some of the excess revenue and use it for public goods. So again, I didn't get everything, so please come find me.
Thank you so much for your question, Arkady. And you know, making any kind of policy recommendations is always so tricky, and I am someone who will not recommend a one-size-fits-all approach, and there are so many complexities once you propose something. So the point that I was trying to make is that whenever the United States approaches those republics, the approach is lacking impact and effectiveness because the nature of the programs, the volume of assistance is contingent upon the U.S. interests elsewhere. What are we going to give them, or what are we going to do with them to be able to accomplish our goals in Afghanistan or with, in our relations with Russia? And granted, there is much more than going on, and some of those republics in Central Asia and not, they have some leverage even over the United States, so there's lots of negotiation involved there as well. But the point I was trying to make is that the United States need to look at those states on their own, not as Washington's helpmates in other parts of the world. And with regard to specific policies, I was thinking about the United States security assistance, and as we know, the budget proposal that came out of the White House this spring proposes to cut U.S. security assistance, which is grant-based. So there is a portfolio of security assistance options that the United States has, and roughly some of those are the so-called grant programs like International Monetary Education Training, IMED, where the government of the United States provides support to those republics which cannot buy training and equipment out of their own funds, but they don't need to repay the United States. So the United States government pays to train military and law enforcement and even civilians to come to the United States for a few weeks to several months and become socialized in a way in the kind of culture that these programs aspire to promote in the foreign militaries. So the idea that comes out of this new budget is to cut down all these free programs for foreign militaries and to focus on foreign military sales, where the countries that can afford to buy military training will pay out of their own budget for the resources that the United States can provide or is willing to provide. So the idea is that, obviously this alarmed the governments in Georgia, in Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and so it's just one of the examples. If research shows that some of those grant programs are really effective effective if they are long-term, sustaining, and they are used to fund greater number of foreign militaries and law enforcement, and they're working. So then the emphasis should be on those programs that are attuned to the needs, the demands of those individual states and societies, rather than thinking along the line of, who do we want to train and how much, so that it is also aligned with U.S. foreign policy interests in other parts of the world. But I absolutely agree with you that the Marshall Plan for Belarus is out of question.
So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Over here, no side.
Adam Stolberg, Georgia Tech. I have a question for you, David. Do you have a sense of the FDI profile of some of these larger firms, both in terms of the magnitude and the type? Because this may have implications for the traction for sanctions. Obviously, the greater the magnitude may create some vulnerabilities there, but the type of FDI may also lead to some countervailing pressures. So, for example, Gazprom has a lot of FDI that involves a lot of social capital with, let's say, West European companies, a lot of joint ventures, joint R&D. Sanctions can have a very high boomerang effect for those types of companies. Other types of FDI may be licensing agreements, etc., that some of these other consolidated industry or companies may have that may be more vulnerable to sanctions. So I was just wondering if you have a sense of that FDI profile, because I think that'll add more traction and understanding the sanctions.
Thanks for that. And finally, here.
Thank you, Mikhail Troitsky from Moscow. And my question is for Vladimir. I might have missed something in your presentation, but my question is straightforward. How much sense does it make at all to distinguish between politicians and technocrats in contemporary Russia? Can you really make that distinction, given, and I think you provided also in Q&A a couple of examples. I think you referred to Lukayev and then perhaps also Nabiullina as your candidates for technocrats, right, in the Russian political system. But I mean, if a technocrat is someone who really, follows the rules, almost regardless of whatever political pressures coming in, and then would rather resign than sort of betray this approach, then, I mean, Nabiullina, the key decision of her career apparently was to to undertake that massive emission in when was that, in December 2014, so that the ruble depreciated twofold just overnight, right? Basically to fund Rosneft's debt payments. And the same goes perhaps to Lukayev, who was in charge of negotiating the Ukraine's association with the European Union. And then, as President Putin himself said, he came back to me and said, there's no way to find a compromise, although there were very clear ways actually to steer that problem before, Maidan happened. Or I might just be getting your presentation wrong. Thank you.
So, David?
Yeah, real quick, I think it's a great question. I have a piece in the Russian Analytical Digest that looks exactly at FDI after sanctions. It's really hurt Western partners. They're really scared of entering into joint ventures with these state corporations because there's so much risk attached to it. But I think there are 2 things stand out in the Russian response to the sanctions in order to keep it up. One is the Russia Direct Investment Fund, which looks at non-Western sovereign wealth funds and tries to build partnerships. One of their success stories is agriculture, and they've gotten millions and millions of dollars from places like Saudi Arabia and even farther east to get into joint ventures that are increasing production. The second is localization, some of the import substitution and protectionism policies, where you force pharmaceutical companies, they want to compete for the massive public procurement in the medicines, they have to build factories or acquire factories domestically. So that's one of those are a couple examples of sectors that have been finding ways to maneuver around sanctions without falling afoul of the U.S. authorities, while still accessing the domestic market, which, as you've been seeing, is not growing necessarily, but is still quite stable.
Very briefly, actually, the distinction between politicians and technocrats is not based upon certain decisions they participate, but rather of availability of resources. The resource of technocrats is policy expertise, while the resource of politicians related to their political connections. That's the difference. Yet, Ulukhaev actually participated in a number of policy decisions which were very controversial, to put it mildly, including the case of privatization of Bashneft, where he became a victim. However, the point is that political leadership need technocrats. Without them, they would be much more vulnerable to making some irreversibly wrong decisions. And this is why actually this hiring of well-qualified managers and keeping them involved in certain decisions but not in others, most likely to be a continuing approach of political leadership elsewhere in the post-Soviet world. However, there are certain limits which should not be exceeded, and my guess that at a certain day Mr. Ulukhaev crossed some boundaries, and this is why he became a victim rather than for being involved in some policy decisions.
Thank you very much. So now you will be served lunch, which is outside this room, and you can bring it back in here. And at 12:45, our special keynote speaker, Celeste Wallander, will address us. So please now join me in thanking our panelists for a very lively discussion.